Montana Territory, July 1882. The sun was going down behind the Bitterroot Range when Everett Granger caught the sound that changed everything, something sharp and desperate, like a woman's cry swallowed by earth. He pulled his bay gelding to a stop along the overgrown trail, the swaying pines whispering in the windless dusk. The sound had come from the direction of the old Dawson property, a homestead left to rot after a fire gutted the main house last winter. Folks said wolves had moved in. Everett knew better than to believe everything people said, but he trusted his gut, and right now, his gut was telling him someone was alive out there. He dismounted, rifle slung across his back, boots crunching over dry pine needles and dirt. The barn was half collapsed, the fence broken in 3 places. But the ground near the charred steps of the cabin looked disturbed. Fresh boot tracks, too large for a woman, too deep for a child. He knelt, brushing aside leaves and dirt. That was when he saw an iron ring bolted to a square of wood, half buried beneath a broken crate, a hatch. He gripped the ring and yanked. The hinges groaned, and the smell hit him, first must, sweat, and something sour like fear. Then he saw her. She was curled in the far corner of the root cellar, tangled hair, dirt-streaked skin, her dress torn at the sleeve. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fire blue and sharp, fixed on him like she was trying to decide whether to trust him or spit at him. "You're coming home now," Everett said, voice low but steady. He reached his hand down, palm open. She stared at him for a long second, then pushed herself up with trembling arms. Her fingers wrapped around his, light as bird bones. When he pulled her up into the fading light, she stumbled into his chest, too weak to stand on her own. He caught her without thinking, arms closing around her gently. "Name's Everett Granger," he said quietly, steadying her. "You're safe now." She sagged against him, breathing hard. "Kiera," she whispered. "Kiera Talbot." He heard a rustle behind them, saddle leather. He turned fast, rifle raised, but the trail was empty, just wind and dusk again. Still, his jaw tightened. Whoever locked her down there might still be close. "We need to ride," he said, pulling her toward his horse. "I can ride," she muttered, though her legs buckled the moment she tried. He lifted her into the saddle without a word. She flinched at first, then went still as he mounted behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to keep her steady. She leaned back slowly, head against his shoulder. He felt her breathing, shallow but alive. They rode hard for his cabin, tucked deep into the trees along the edge of the valley. He kept looking over his shoulder. No one followed. By the time they reached his place, 2 rooms, a well and a barn. Kiera was half asleep. He carried her inside and laid her gently on the cot by the stove. "You need water," he said, filling a tin cup from the pitcher on the shelf. She drank slowly, eyes never leaving his face. "He locked me down there when I said I would not marry him," she said, her voice rasping. "I said no, and he laughed. Then he threw me down there and left me." Everett's jaw tightened. "Who was he?" "Rufus Kane. He bought my father's land after Pa passed." "Said I came with it." Everett's stomach turned. He had heard the name Kane was a rancher with money and fists, but no one had ever proved anything. Now Everett had. "You got family?" he asked. She shook her head. "Mama died years ago, no siblings, just me." Her voice cracked and she looked down. "I thought I was going to die in that dark." He crouched in front of her, tilting her chin up gently. "You are not dying. You are here, with me." She blinked fast, like she had not expected kindness. That night he built up the fire and gave her the bed. He slept in the barn, but not before checking every lock, every window. Kiera slept straight through till morning. By the second day she had color in her cheeks again. She sat by the stove, a blanket around her shoulders, sipping hot coffee. "You do not ask many questions," she said. "Only the ones that matter," Everett replied. She smiled faintly. It was the first time he had seen her smile 3 days past. Each morning, Everett chopped wood, and each evening she helped him peel potatoes or fold laundry. Her strength returned in pieces. She laughed once at something he said about his stubborn horse. Her laugh was soft and startled, like she had forgotten how one night, as dusk bled into the sky, she stood on the porch beside him. "You saved me," she said quietly. "I found you," Everett answered. "That is not the same." "It is to me." He looked at her, the way the wind pulled her hair across her cheek, the way her eyes held his like she was trying to memorize him. "I feel safe here," she said, her voice barely above the crickets. "You are," Everett said, and meant it. She reached out, her hand brushing his. Not by accident. Neither of them pulled away. The next morning, Everett rode into town, leaving Kiera with his shotgun and a promise to return by noon. He went to the sheriff's office and laid it all out, what Kane had done, what he had seen and what he had found. Sheriff Reynolds listened, grim-faced. "You willing to testify?" Everett nodded. "She will too when she is ready. Kane will run," the sheriff said. "You know that." "Not if you ride now," Everett said. "Take him before he knows she is free." By sundown, Rufus Kane was in irons. When Everett returned home, Kiera met him at the door, eyes wide, hands clenched around the edge of her shawl. "You told them," she said. "I had to." She stepped forward. "And if he comes back, he will not." She looked up at him, that same fire in her eyes. "I do not want to leave here." He took her hands in his. "Then stay." She did not answer with words. She leaned in slowly, her forehead resting against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her like she was the most important thing he had ever touched. And maybe she was. The rain started quietly, falling in thin, silver lines against the cabin roof. Everett was mending the front gate with a coil of wire and a pair of fence pliers when he heard the door creak open behind him. He didn't turn. He knew her footsteps now bare against the porch planks, light but steady. "You didn't say you had a brother," Kiera said. "I don't," Everett replied, twisting the wire tighter. "Why? There's a letter here addressed to you. Says it's from a man named Lee Granger, postmarks from Helena." He stood slowly, brushing rain from his hat brim. "That'd be my father's cousin's boy. We shared a roof for a few years, but he left for mining work in '78. She handed him the crumpled envelope, her fingers brushing his as she did. He opened it with a slow tear, eyes scanning the page. Then he folded it again, tight and precise. "He's asking after land. Wants to know if I'd be willing to sell a strip along the creek. Says he's planning to bring his family west." Kiera watched his face. "Will you?" "No," Everett said. "There's too much blood in this soil already." She didn't ask what he meant. Instead, she reached for the second basket of beans by the door. "We could take these to the widow Nance tomorrow. She hasn't had much in her garden this season. You thinking of staying long enough to be neighborly now?" His voice was quiet, but something warm flickered beneath it. "I'm thinking of staying long enough to plant something," she said, not looking at him. "And see it grow." The rain thickened. Everett stepped inside and shut the door behind him. She was already at the stove, stirring the pot with care. Her sleeves were rolled, her hair damp from the mist. "You cook the way someone taught you, gentle but not careful." "My mother taught me," she said. All her recipes started with lard and ended in silence. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. What was her name? Ruth. There was a long moment where neither of them spoke. The fire cracked low in the hearth. The smell of beans and salt pork filled the small room. "She used to say a woman could carry sorrow 2 ways," Kiera went on, voice low, "tied up in her apron or buried in her back. I think she carried hers in both." Everett stepped closer, not to offer comfort but to listen better. "When I was small, she'd sit by the window during storms, sewing until her fingers bled. Said thunder cleared Old Hurt from the air. He nodded once. You still believe that? She turned toward him, her eyes tracing something on his face. Tonight I might. Dinner was quiet. Rain tapping the windows, 2 spoons scraping from opposite sides of a tin pot. When they finished, Everett rose and cleared the bowls while Kiera dried her hands on a rag and lit the oil lamp. The flame flickered, casting her in gold. You never said what made you come down that trail, she said. He wiped the table with slow strokes. Was hauling salt blocks to the cattle. Heard something I couldn't explain. Most men would have kept going. I'm not most men. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. I keep seeing the hatch, she said after a pause. Wood above me like a coffin lid. I'd count the knots in the boards until I fell asleep. There were 37. Everett pulled a chair close and sat across from her. You don't have to sleep in there anymore. I know. She looked at the door. But I still wake up facing the corner. He didn't offer platitudes. Instead, he reached across the table and set his hand over hers. Rough skin, warm and steady. You're not where you were, he said. She looked down at their hands. Feels like I've forgotten how to be something besides afraid. Then remember something else, he said. Start with what's right in front of you. She didn't pull away. Later, when the fire had burned low, Everett unrolled his bedroll by the hearth as usual. But Kiera stood by the cot, unmoving. You don't have to sleep on the floor, she said, voice soft. He looked up at her. The flicker of the fire caught the edge of her jaw, made her look older and younger at the same time. I'm not sure you're ready for that. I know I'm not, she said, but I'd like to sit beside you, just for a minute. I don't want to be alone with the quiet tonight. He nodded once. She sat down on the edge of the cot, and he took the stool beside her. They didn't speak. The silence stretched, not heavy but full of something growing between them, slow, deliberate, like roots beneath frost-hardened earth. When her shoulder touched his, neither of them moved. The fire dimmed, the rain slowed. And for the first time since he pulled her from the ground, she closed her eyes without fear. By late August, the wind had turned dry and restless, carrying with it the scent of distant fires and early dust. Kiera stood barefoot in the edge row of Everett's garden, her skirt hem brushing the tops of the pea vines as she leaned forward, thumb pressing gently at the pods. She had begun planting in the mornings, when the light sat soft and slanted across the valley. Her hands were steadier now, no longer trembling when they brushed soil or reached for tools, and her eyes didn't dart toward every sudden sound. Everett had watched this change without speaking on it. He gave her space, but never distance. That morning, he'd gone east to help old Mr. Havers repair a broken axle. He'd be back by dusk, he'd said, and left her with the cow to milk and the hens to collect from. She did both without pause, tying her hair back with the strip of calico Everett had cut from an old shirt. She found she liked the rhythm of this place, the honest labor, the quiet. The way the day told you what was needed and you simply did it. She was stacking kindling by the stove when the knock came. Not a neighbor's knock, not the cautious tap of someone unsure. This was hard, confident, twice. Kiera froze, one hand still wrapped around a branch of pine. Her breath caught like it used to when the cellar door groaned above her. But then she stood, slowly, and crossed the room. She unlatched the door and opened it a crack. A man stood on the porch, boots scuffed, shirt crisp despite the trail. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but he lifted it as soon as he saw her. "You're Everett's woman, are you?" he asked. Kiera's spine straightened. "Who's asking?" "Name's Amos Trigg. I'm from down Deer Creek way." "Heard something about a woman found out near the Dawson place. Thought maybe you'd know the truth of it." "What truth are you hoping to find?" she asked. He scratched at his jaw. "Kane's kin been asking around, not in town quiet like. They don't know where she went, but they're looking." I figure a woman who disappears from one spot and shows up in another might not be safe until they stop. I didn't disappear, Kiera said. I survived. They won't see it that way. She looked past him, toward the ridge where the sun was just starting to fall behind the trees. You came to warn me. I came so Everett would know. But he ain't here, and I figure you've got a mind of your own. She nodded once. Thank you. Amos tipped his hat and left without asking anything more. Kiera barred the door behind him and lit the second lamp. She moved through the space, checking shutters, counting matches, relacing the boots she'd left by the hearth in case she needed to run. But she didn't feel panic, not like she once did. Just a sharpness behind her ribs. A readiness. When Everett returned, leading the mule cart with split timber stacked high, he saw it in her straight shoulders and the way she waited by the edge of the porch. You expecting trouble? He asked, unloading the first bundle. A man came. Said Kane's people are sniffing around. Not law, just family. Everett set the wood down and wiped his hands. Did he threaten you? No, he warned me, said I've got a mind of my own. He nodded slowly, then looked toward the barn. I'll sleep lighter tonight. Kiera stepped down from the porch and took the rope from his hands, tying it off against the post. You ever think about what comes next? I think about it every morning, Everett said. She hesitated, then said, I want to stay, not just for a season. I want to build something that can't be taken. He looked at her for a long time, then said, You already have. That night they sat on the cabin floor, sorting dried beans into shallow pans. Their hands worked in silence, but not the kind that weighed. The kind that filled in between things unspoken. Kiera paused once, holding a white bean between her fingers. When I was small, she said, I thought marriage was something decided by a man's will, like livestock or land. I never saw it done with care. Everett didn't answer right away. He ran his thumb along the edge of the pan, then said, If I ever asked, it would be with your eyes open and your hands free. She looked at him and her voice didn't falter. Then ask. He set the pan down. Stay with me, Kiera, not because you have to, because you want to. I do, she said. I want to build this life with you, from the ground up. He leaned in and kissed her, slow and sure, like he'd been waiting for exactly that moment. Her hands found his collar, her breath warm against his cheek. Nothing rushed, nothing uncertain. When morning came, they stood together by the fence line, watching the light spill over the valley. The old fear was still there, somewhere deep, but it didn't rule her anymore. And when Everett reached for her hand, she laced her fingers through his without hesitation. They had no written vows. No preacher. Just two souls who had survived what should not have been survived and found each other in the pieces. It was enough. It was everything. The first frost came early that year, silvering the roof shingles and turning the creek's edge brittle before the leaves had finished falling. Everett rose before the sun, as he always did, and split wood by lantern light. The cold had settled into the ground overnight, and each strike of his axe rang sharper than usual, the sound carrying clean across the valley. Inside, Kiera stood at the washbasin, sleeves rolled high, pouring warm water from the kettle. She worked quietly, her movements practiced now, steady. Her eyes still held shadows on some mornings, but they no longer looked backward. The lines around her mouth were stronger, not from frowning but from holding firm. She dried her hands and stepped out onto the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. It'll be a hard winter, she said. Everett leaned the axe against the wall and looked toward the ridge where snow already clung to the highest pines. I'll trap more this season. Trade for what we can't grow. Kiera nodded, then hesitated. I've been thinking about the old schoolhouse near Alder Creek. It's in rough shape, but the roof's still good. You thinking of teaching? There's children out that way. No one's looked after their learning since the preacher's wife left for Illinois. If I don't do it, I don't know who will. He studied her, the way her hands didn't fidget when she spoke, how her chin lifted slightly when she met his gaze. You'd have to ride out alone some mornings. I know the trail, and I can shoot straight thanks to you. Everett's eyes softened. Then I'll fix the stirrups on the mare. She'll be better for cold mornings than the gelding. They didn't speak of the risks. They didn't need to. Kiera had already made her decision, and Everett wasn't the kind of man to stand in the way of a woman doing right by her own sense of purpose. Later that week, they rode out together to the schoolhouse. The windows were dusty but unbroken, and the front door swung open on its hinges with only a little resistance. Inside, the desks were still there, though some had warped legs or were missing inkwells. A small stove sagged in the corner. Kiera stepped inside first, her boots echoing on the plank floor. I can clean this up, she said. It just needs hands on it. Everett looked around. You'll have to haul water from the creek. I can manage that. You planning to do this alone? I'm not alone. They returned the next day with a sack of nails, a hammer, and oil for the hinges. All week, Kiera worked from sunrise to near dark, scrubbing soot from the stovepipe, sanding splinters from the desks, scrubbing the slate board clean. Everett helped when he could, but he left her to most of it. He understood what it meant to claim something with your own hands. On Saturday evening, she returned to the cabin with soot on her cheeks and a blister blooming across her palm. She sat on the bench by the stove, stretching her fingers. Everett poured water into the basin, unwrapped a scrap of cloth, and dabbed coolness over the burn. You should have said something. I didn't notice it until I stopped. His touch was careful but not hesitant. You're stubborn, he said. She met his eyes. You didn't take me in hoping for someone delicate. No, he said. I took you in not knowing what you'd become. And now, I think I knew even then. She leaned into him, her fingers curling around the edge of his shirt. If I'd never been locked away, I wouldn't have found this place. Found you. You shouldn't have had to be broken first. I wasn't broken, she said. Just buried. You helped dig me out. They stood together for a long time, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people who had each chosen the other again and again with small acts and quiet certainties. That night, Kiera pulled her own blanket from the chest and spread it across the cot beside Everett's. She didn't speak, and neither did he. But when he lay down, he reached for her hand beneath the covers, and she let her fingers rest against his, palm to palm. By mid-November, the schoolhouse opened. 3 children came the first week, then 2 more, brought by a mother who'd heard of the lessons through the postman. Kiera wrote letters to a bookseller in Missoula and traded preserves for slates and chalk. Everett repaired the fence line and cleared the trail, but he stopped by the schoolhouse each Friday afternoon, just long enough to bring her whatever she might need for the week ahead. One evening, as snow began to fall in heavy flakes across the pasture, Everett returned to the cabin to find a scarf hanging by the door, one he hadn't seen before. Kiera stepped out from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. I traded with the widow Nance for the wool, she said. I figured your neck could use the extra warmth. He took it in his hands, turning it over once. You made this, she shrugged. It's plain work. It's good work. He stepped closer, then tied it around his throat with slow fingers. Her hands brushed his as she helped tighten the knot. You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have, she said quietly. You gave yourself, he answered. She reached up, resting her hand against his jaw. This is home now. He nodded and kissed her then, not out of urgency, but with the deep steadiness of something built to last. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the ground in silence. Inside, the fire burned warm. And between them, nothing was unfinished. By mid-December, the valley had gone still under a thick hush of snow. The mountains were quiet, their slopes choked in white, and every tree stood cloaked in frost-heavy silence. The schoolhouse was shuttered for the season, and with the children kept home by ice-bound trails, Kiera turned her attention inward to the home she and Everett were shaping with steady hands and quiet certainty. She'd taken to mending in the afternoons by the hearth, the new ticking mattress she'd sewn herself now spread on the cot they shared. Everett had built a wooden chest for her things, carved with wildflowers she described to him from her mother's garden. Her books, what few she had, sat on a shelf he'd mounted above the stove, next to the tin of tea he'd begun steeping for her each morning without her asking. One evening, after he returned from checking the trap lines, he laid a parcel wrapped in calico across her lap. "Traded with the McLennan brothers," he said. "They were hauling grain through the pass and owed me for helping their mule out of a ditch." Kiera unfolded the cloth slowly, revealing a length of soft wool in a deep russet shade. She ran her fingers over it, jaw tight with something she didn't speak aloud. "I thought maybe you'd like to make something for yourself," he said. "Or for spring." She looked up at him. "You remembered my mother had something like this." "I remember everything you tell me." She folded the wool carefully and placed it in the chest, then stood and walked to where he was unlacing his boots. "You never say much about before," she said. "Before you came here." He didn't speak right away. Then, without raising his eyes, he said, "My mother died when I was 13. My father drank most of what we had after that. I left Missouri with what I could carry and didn't look back." There wasn't anything worth remembering. Kiera sat beside him, close enough their shoulders touched. "You built something worth remembering here." He nodded, then looked at her fully. "I didn't know how much I needed someone to see it." The lamp flickered between them, casting their shadows long on the wall. She reached for his hand and pressed it to her chest, over her heart. "You gave me back my name." Not just the sound of it, but what it meant to be Kiera again. He leaned in, slow and certain, and kissed her there, in the quiet warmth of the home they'd built, with snow piling against the windows and the wind held outside. That winter, they made their days with small rituals. Everett carved spoons from cedar scrap, while Kiera stitched new curtains from flour sacks. On Sundays, they read aloud from the single worn volume of poetry she'd carried west from Kentucky. He would pause over unfamiliar words, and she would explain them with the careful patience of someone who had once taught herself to read by moonlight. One morning in early March, with the thaw beginning to pull at the edges of the creek, Everett stood by the stove, folding a piece of paper in half. "I've been writing this for a while," he said, holding it out to her. "Didn't want to say it until I knew it right." She took it and read, lips moving silently. Then she looked up, eyes damp but steady. "You really want this?" He stepped forward, hands at his sides. "Want it more than I've ever wanted anything." "I do too," she said, voice thick. "I want it with you." They were married the following week, with the widow Nance and her grown son as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, just words spoken plain and true in the clearing behind the cabin, where the first shoots of spring had begun pushing up through the thaw. Neither wore fine clothes. Everett had shaved and polished his boots, and Kiera wore the dress she'd mended with the russet wool, stitched with a row of tiny wildflowers along the hem. She carried a handful of pine and dried lavender, bundled in twine. Afterward, they shared coffee sweetened with molasses and a small loaf of bread baked in the old cast-iron pan. The sun was warm for the first time in weeks, and Everett pressed his forehead to hers as they stood by the fence line, arms wrapped around her waist. "You happy?" he asked. She nodded against his chest. "I've never felt more like myself." Through the spring, the schoolhouse filled again. Kiera rode out twice a week, Everett escorting her as far as the ridge before turning back to tend the land. In the evenings, she told him what the children had learned, and he listened as he whittled or shelled beans, nodding when she laughed, quiet when she didn't. That summer, they planted a second garden plot and dug a root cellar of their own, deeper and wider than the one where she'd once been buried alive. It was her idea, and she stood beside Everett as he laid the first stones, hands steady on the shovel. They were not people who spoke much of hope, but they lived it in the way they rose each day and shaped their life with intention. In the way they reached for each other without needing to ask. Years passed, and the cabin grew to include a second room and a porch wide enough for 2 chairs. Kiera taught more children than she could count, and Everett's name became one spoken with quiet respect in every household from Alder Creek to the West Fork. They never left the valley. They never needed to. One autumn morning, long after the last frost had dusted the fields silver and gone, Everett sat on the porch, his hand wrapped around Kiera's. "You remember that day I found you?" he asked, voice low. "I remember the sound of your voice more than anything," she said. It was the first thing that felt real again. He turned to her, his face lined from sun and years, but his eyes unchanged. "You were always real. You just needed the world to catch up." And in the long light that fell across the land they had made together, they sat in stillness, surrounded by the life they had chosen, one built from survival, shaped by love, and carried forward by the quiet, powerful strength of 2 people who had never stopped reaching for one another. Always forward, always together.